Jimmy, what's up, man? I actually made a little prototype of an iris. So I have an idea. I want to make this big and out of metal. Sound like something that you can help out with?
Of course.
Sounds great. Well, I'll head your way.
Come on up.
So today's video is going to be super exciting. I have teamed up with the OG of the maker community, Jimmy Diresta, to bring you guys a super crazy and fun build. So I've always been fascinated by the mechanical iris, like what is in a camera lens. So I found a file online, and using the thunder laser, I was able to cut this prototype, and it turned out really cool. But with it being so small and made out of wood, really what type of application would it be good for? So I decided that I needed some help with this. I wanted this thing huge, made out of metal, and somehow incorporate it into a piece of furniture. Well, not every creator out there is crazy enough to dive into something like this. I knew exactly the person to call. Let's go to New York. So I packed my bags, my little 9-inch prototype, and headed to Jimmy's Maker Central. I'm not gonna lie, it was a little bit overwhelming at first. This place was huge and had so much going on. I mean, who has 2 boats in their shop? But as much as I wanted to just play in the Maker's Playground, I only had a few days to knock this project out. And the first and most important step for this entire build is seeing if this big metal contraption that I've dreamed up can come to life. Jimmy had told me that this would be no problem, but we'll see about that. And when he was trying to explain to me how the program worked for the plasma cutter, I was lost as an Easter egg. After all, I still design on graphing paper. So I just sat there and shook my head like I knew exactly what he was talking about.
We just hope that the gearing is going to fit, but we'll find out the hard way.
Then it was time to let the plasma cutter do its work, and this thing was awesome. It did seem a little sketchy that we were using high voltage electricity with water, and Jimmy tried to explain to me how all of that worked. So if you're curious, you're going to have to Google it. So by this point I knew that if we could get this big metal contraption built, I wanted to put it in something wooden, like a wooden table. But I couldn't even start designing this until I knew exactly how big this iris was going to turn out. And it turned out really big. I had told Jimmy that I wanted this thing to be huge, and he made huge. My 9-inch prototype now had a 2-foot diameter. And the parts looked awesome. But the big question was, could we put this together and actually make it work? So while Patrick and I were busy grinding off all of the burrs and shining this metal up, Jimmy was working on the pivot points for each one of the leaves of this iris. And while we finished cleaning up these parts, just an FYI, Jimmy has also posted a video of this build from his perspective. So after you finish this video, make sure to go check his out. I'll make sure to throw a link to that video in the description. And before I knew it, the teamwork had paid off. The parts were looking great and they were ready for assembly. But the big question that was in the back of my mind was, will these parts line up? But with something this large, everything has to line up perfectly. And piece by piece, everything started falling into place. It looked exactly like my little prototype. But now on to the next problem to solve. For the prototype, I used screws as guides for the inner ring. And that inner ring is what keeps all of the gears in place and essentially makes the iris work. But before I could even present this problem that I had, you already had it figured out. Attaching these guides would be the final step before we could actually give this thing a try. And now it was time for the moment of truth, to actually try this thing out, the deciding factor of whether this project goes on or we go back to the drawing board. And when things weren't looking so good, it happened. The beast was alive. My vision had been turned into reality. Now that we had a 2-foot functioning iris, I could start working on the table. So we loaded up and headed to
Cooksburg Sawmill
to grab some material. Super cool place. I think we got some material to make a nice base and top for this. So we'll see.
back to the junkyard.
Back to work. So with the metal work on this build mostly done, I will be taking the reins from here on the woodworking side. There was one problem that I noticed while we were at the sawmill that I really didn't bring up, but all of this wood was green. Now I grew up in a sawmill, so I've handled millions of board feet of lumber, but it was all dried, it was all reclaimed lumber. I have never worked with green wood, and let me tell you, working with rough cut green wood it's an experience. So knowing that it would be a waste of time for me to join this material or plane it down, I had to make some last minute changes to my design. I had to build a base that would allow this wood to move. So the night before, I stayed up and came up with this, a 4-foot hexagon tabletop with a perfect circle cut in the middle. Now drawing a perfect circle, that's no problem. But in order to draw a perfect hexagon, you need a compass. And to draw one that's 4 foot, you need a big one. And thank God at some point in his life, Jimmy must have stolen one from a giant. And now that I have my layout, it's time to get to work. And I'm going to start out with this hexagon frame for the top. Now all of these corners should have been done with wooden dowels. Now at this point, in order to catch my flight, I have to leave at noon the following day. So screws are going to have to work, but I did not use glue to allow for movement. So with that done, I moved on to the legs. By this point, I had decided that I wanted it to be an exterior table. You know, one that people could just sit around and eat or have drinks at. So knowing that the tabletop itself was going to weigh a ton, I decided to half lap these legs. That way the weight of the table would actually be sitting on the center of the leg. And I'm sure that he had a dado stack laying around somewhere, but you know how it is when you're working in someone else's shop. Just use what you have. With the top notches of the legs cut, I moved over to the table saw to cut the notches for the bottom railing. So I'm used to using small chisels. So I guess Jimmy got tired of hearing the tappity tap of my chisel and brought me over one as big as my leg and taught me the proper way to use it. And that's what I love about working with other makers. You can always learn something. But I'm definitely ordering me a set of these huge chisels. Really not sure what they're called. I'm just going to call them dog-leg chisels. There's one thing that I learned while I was in New York is if you don't know the name for something, then you just make it up.
Get you looking nice and choochie for the ladies.
And before I left, I actually busted them out about using words that did not exist. Make sure to hang around for the outtakes. It's well worth it. So after I got all of my notches cut and cleaned up, I went ahead and started cutting the strips for the bottom railing. And this railing will also form an octagon. And remember how I said that you can always learn something from other makers? Check this out. This is genius. He has CA glued CA glue to a block to keep it from tipping over. And the whole reason why I noticed this is because I'm using CA glue just to hold these parts together until I can get some screws in it. Since CA glue is brittle, I really don't have to worry about the wood cracking as it shrinks. And now I'll just install this inner ring to my legs. And so have you wondered where everyone went? They're not just sitting around watching me do my thing. Check it out, we're all kind of working on projects at the same time. There's Patrick here, what are you working on, man? Check out this boat.
This is just for serving drinks off of. It's never going to see the water because it would sink in a heartbeat.
Patrick is wiring up a boat.
And Jimmy's over here on the bandsaw. What are you into?
I'm playing around with this idea I have for photographs. I want to make like stacked photographs. So experimenting.
And outside of the shop, Rob rolls in on a 1953 John Deere dozer. So to say the least, there's never a dull moment. So after my field trip was over, I started back on my tabletop. And since this was a hexagon, I thought that it would be pretty cool to make like a pinwheel effect. Plus, as the wood shrinks, it would just add to the character. And to attach all of these parts together, we decided to use some exterior grade plywood and about 1 million different fasteners. While I was finishing that up, Jimmy was making a router jig that would cut the exact size circle that we needed for our iris. At least that's what I was really hoping, because if we cut this hole too big, I would have to remake the entire tabletop, and I simply did not have time for that. But knowing this wasn't his first rodeo, I had faith. So I moved on to making the trim for the tabletop. Once that was made, I went ahead and flush cut all of my sides and installed the trim. Again, if I had had more time, these would have all been countersank and then capped off with dowels. Unfortunately, I did not have that luxury. But now it was time to install the iris into the tabletop. Jimmy whipped up and installed some mounting brackets, and 3, 2, 1, bingo. This thing is turning out so awesome. Now with everything in place, we just needed to weld the iris to the mounting brackets. And when I say we, I mean Jimmy. The form of welding that I do, I call it bush welding. It's basically making two pieces of metal stick together until they fall apart. Then you just re-weld it. So I'll just leave this one to the pro. And I had to get back to work on the base because unfortunately, this is my last day. I actually have a flight to catch in about 5 hours. So I secure the bottom and the top hexagons to all of the legs and then start to install all of my side slats. I had planned on staining this, but I think we're going to torch it. You just want a little bit of color contrast between the actual base and the top. Kind of neat if the color contrast also went into these side braces that I just put on. So I'm going to go ahead and pop those back off. Kind of in a rush because last day, so getting as much done as possible. So I took my side slats back off. And with Jimmy's moral support, me and Patrick packed this thing outside. We fired up the brush burner and got things nice and toasty. I really feel sorry for the person that sat beside me on the plane, because I know I smell like burnt wood, sawdust, and work. I guess there's worse smells. Now let's try this again. After replacing the side slats, it was finally time to attach the tabletop to the base. Jimmy whipped up some more mounting brackets. I installed those onto the base, and then connected those to the top. We all finally got to see what the two look like together. And what an awesome feeling, taking this tiny prototype and seeing what it has been transformed into. Even though the table was not completely finished, it was just a reminder to me that if you can dream something up, then you can make it happen. And if you're not able to do it yourself, never hesitate to ask for help from a friend. With just a sketch and a prototype, we have made a 4-foot functioning table. But hold up, the story doesn't end here.
What's going to happen in this fall? What do we know? We know we have a couple of ideas, but spontaneously, what do you think?
I think fire.
So right before I had to leave, we decided that we were going to make this into an outdoor fire pit. I wish that I was able to stay and actually see all of this out to the end, but it was in good hands. And the final result was a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, the product of just an idea and good friends working together and having a good time. Okay, so I have heard this term all throughout my travels here, chooched up, okay? And I've heard it used in many different contexts. So what is the definition of...
Chooch means just get it in shape. My Dominican barber in the Lower East Side that would cut my hair for many years, he would always go, get you looking nice and choochy. His name is Socrates, so he'd be like, get you looking nice and choochy for the ladies, he would always say to me, joking around. So I started using it on sometimes you just have no better word.
I use the word schmutz all the time.
Yeah.
You're schmutz, we're gonna put some schmutz on it.
Yeah, that means it's,
You know what I mean,
painted or
that thing, I
fixed it up.
can't think of the name, it's schmutz.
so sometimes it comes out all too often. I'm like, yeah, let's just chooch this up and get it going. Basically, means let's put it together and move on. It'd be
now
funny to hear you
understand.
say, can you say it?
Chooch?
Chooch.
Chooch this up?
No, say chooch.
Chooch.
No, you guys say chooch.
No, chooch.
No, you
No, yeah, chooch.
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 You practice.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound right.
I don't have it. It's the southern and, you know, it's
Chooch.
chooch.
You can't chooch it.
Chooch. You gotta
You
chooch
gotta
this
chooch.
up.
So like this. 1, 2, 3. Are you gonna buy a plasma table, man?
Probably not.
Could just fly,
Too much
get on a
work.
plane and fly too.
Buying the cutter.
You come first.
Yeah.
Guillotine. Off with his head.